My name's Thomas Avery, a freelance journalist who's always been a little too curious for his own good. I've spent years chasing down the strange and unexplained, the kind of stuff most people avoid talking about. It's this curiosity that led me, a few years back, to a decision that I still regret today. My wife, Linda, and I decided to take a spontaneous road trip. We needed a break from the city, a chance to breathe and reconnect in the quiet of nature. So, we chose the dense, remote forests of Maine, a place where we thought we'd find some peace. But what we found was far from peaceful. Linda and I weren't thrill-seekers looking for an adrenaline rush. We were just a couple trying to escape the noise of everyday life. We wanted to leave behind the stress of deadlines, the constant buzz of the city, and just enjoy the serenity of the woods. I remember the day we left like it was yesterday. The air was crisp, the sky a perfect shade of blue, and we felt a sense of adventure that was almost intoxicating. But I never could have imagined the path this adventure would lead us down. If I had known, I'd have turned back then and there. As we drove deeper into the forest, Linda started talking about some of the stories I'd written over the years, the mysteries I'd unraveled. "Wouldn't it be something," she said, "if we stumbled upon one of those stories out here?" We laughed it off, not realizing just how prophetic her words would turn out to be. I mean, how often does a journalist actually live out one of their own stories? But as the trees grew denser and the road narrower, I started to feel a gnawing sense of unease. Something didn't feel right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I'm not one to believe in fate or destiny, but looking back, it's almost as if we were being pulled toward something. The air grew thicker, more oppressive, and the sounds of the forest seemed to die away. I remember glancing at Linda, trying to gauge if she felt it too, and the look on her face told me everything I needed to know. She was scared, but trying not to show it. I guess we both were. And yet, neither of us suggested turning back. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was curiosity, or maybe, deep down, we knew it was already too late. I'm writing this not to entertain or to scare you, but to warn you. Sometimes it's best not to follow where curiosity leads. Linda and I learned that the hard way. What started as a simple road trip through the woods turned into something much darker, something I still have trouble wrapping my head around. We thought we could handle whatever came our way. After all, we had each other, and we had our wits. But some things, some places, are beyond human understanding. And once you step into that world, it's nearly impossible to find your way back. The events that unfolded changed us, and not for the better. They left scars that no amount of time or therapy can heal. And the worst part, we're still living with the consequences. Every day, we're reminded of the choices we made and the path we took. If you're reading this, I hope you take my words to heart. Some doors once opened can never be closed. Some roads once traveled can never be forgotten. And some stories once lived can never be undone. Linda and I decided to take a shortcut that wasn't on any map, a decision that seemed harmless enough at the time. The road was narrow, winding through dense patches of towering trees that seemed to close in on us with every mile. The further we drove, the thicker the fog became, swirling around us like a living thing. Our GPS lost signal, and with it, our sense of direction. We should have turned back right then, but the idea of an adventure, of finding something new, kept us going. What we found, though, wasn't what we expected. After what felt like hours of driving in circles, the fog suddenly lifted, revealing a sight that chilled us to the bone. A ghost town, seemingly abandoned for decades, stood before us. The buildings were in various stages of decay, their wooden frames sagging and covered in vines. It was as if time had forgotten this place, leaving it to wither away in silence. The air was still, almost too still, and the silence was deafening. I could feel Linda's unease growing next to me, but we both knew we had to see more. We parked the car at the edge of the town, and as we stepped out, the fog seemed to thicken again, wrapping around the buildings like a shroud. There was no sign of life, not even a bird or an insect, just an overwhelming sense of emptiness. Linda suggested we take a quick look around, and against my better judgment, I agreed. Curiosity, as they say, killed the cat. But in this case, it led us into something far more sinister. Walking through the main street, we saw remnants of a life that once was a broken wagon, a rusted bicycle, a swing swaying in the breeze. Each step we took seemed to echo louder than the last, amplifying the silence that surrounded us. It felt as if the town was holding its breath, waiting for something. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that we had intruded on something that didn't want to be disturbed. But Linda pressed on, her eyes darting from one building to the next, drawn to the unknown. We approached what looked like the town hall, its large doors barely hanging on their hinges. I pushed them open, and they creaked loudly, as if protesting our entry. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the floorboards creaked under our weight. In the center of the room was a dusty table with something on it, a book. As we got closer, I could see it was a diary, its cover worn and its pages yellowed with age. Linda reached for it, and I felt a sudden urge to stop her, a gut feeling that screamed at me to leave it alone. But she picked it up, brushing off the dust, and opened it. The first few pages were filled with neat handwriting, but what caught her attention was the content. The diary described the exact fog we had driven through, the road that had seemed to stretch on forever, and the ghost town that now surrounded us. My heart began to race as I realized that this wasn't just any diary, it was a record of our journey, written before we even set foot in this place. Linda looked at me, her face pale, and whispered, "What is this?" I didn't have an answer, but I knew one thing for certain. We needed to leave, and fast. As we turned to go, the fog outside seemed to grow thicker, pressing against the windows like a living thing. I grabbed Linda's hand, and we ran back to the car, but something in me knew that leaving wouldn't be that easy. The diary felt like a trap, a warning that we had ignored. And as we fumbled with the car keys, I heard something, a faint whisper, almost imperceptible, but it was there. We weren't alone. And whatever was out there wasn't going to let us go without a fight. We made our way into one of the decaying houses, hoping to find some clue about what this place used to be or why it was left behind. The front door creaked open, revealing a dim, dusty interior that seemed untouched for years. The floor was littered with debris, and cobwebs hung like curtains in every corner. As we stepped inside, I felt a chill run down my spine, a sense that we had crossed into a place where we didn't belong. But Linda was determined to explore, her curiosity pushing her forward, while I hesitated at the doorway. In the living room, we found the diary, resting on a dusty table like it had been waiting for us. Its leather cover was cracked and worn, but it felt strangely warm to the touch, almost alive. Linda opened it, and we saw that the pages were filled with a neat, flowing script. At first, it seemed like the ramblings of a lonely soul, but as Linda read aloud, my blood ran cold. The diary described everything we had just experienced: the fog, the endless road, the ghost town. It even mentioned us by name, detailing our every step, as if someone had been watching us all along. We flipped through the pages, our hands trembling, and found entries that went beyond what we had lived so far. The diary seemed to predict our future actions, things we hadn't done yet, but now felt compelled to avoid. It spoke of a path through the woods that would lead us back to the same spot, over and over again. It mentioned figures in the fog, whispers in the dark, and an unseen force that would prevent us from leaving. Linda's face went pale, and I knew she was thinking the same thing as me. We were trapped. The more we read, the more the words seemed to change, shifting on the page like they were alive, rewriting themselves as if reacting to our presence. It felt like the diary was pulling us deeper into its story, binding us to its cursed pages. Linda slammed the book shut, her hands shaking. "We have to get out of here," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. I nodded, but as we turned to leave, the air grew colder, and I felt a presence behind us, something unseen but undeniably there. We tried to leave the house, but the front door wouldn't budge. It was as if it had been sealed shut by some invisible force. Panic set in as I realized we were trapped, and I started banging on the door, shouting for help, even though I knew no one was around to hear us. Linda grabbed my arm, pulling me away from the door. "Thomas, listen," she said, her voice trembling. I stopped and listened, and that's when I heard the faint sound of a pen scratching on paper, coming from the diary on the table. We slowly turned to look at the diary, which was now open again, its pages flipping on their own as if caught in a breeze. But there was no wind, no movement in the still, heavy air. The sound of writing grew louder, more frantic, and I could see words forming on the blank pages, describing us standing there, watching in horror. The diary was writing itself, documenting our fear, our desperation. It was then that I realized we were no longer in control. Whatever force had brought us here was dictating our every move, and there was no escape. Linda grabbed the diary, intending to tear it apart, but as soon as she touched it, a powerful force threw her across the room. She hit the wall with a sickening thud and crumpled to the floor, unconscious. I ran to her side, shaking her, trying to wake her up, but she didn't respond. I felt a wave of terror wash over me as I realized that whatever was controlling this place was far more powerful than we could have imagined. And it wasn't going to let us leave without a fight. The room grew darker, shadows creeping in from every corner, converging on us like a pack of wolves closing in on their prey. I heard a voice then, faint and distant, whispering words I couldn't understand. It sounded like a warning, or maybe a threat, but either way, it sent chills down my spine. I knew we had to get out of there, but with Linda unconscious and the door sealed shut, I had no idea how. All I could do was hold her close and pray that somehow we'd find a way to escape this nightmare. We tried to leave the ghost town, thinking we could simply retrace our steps back to the car, but the road seemed to defy all logic. No matter which direction we turned, we kept ending up at the same spot, right in front of that eerie house where we found the diary. It was like the town was a maze that shifted around us, trapping us inside its twisted corridors. Panic began to set in as the fog thickened, swallowing up the path behind us and making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. I felt like we were walking in circles, and the more we walked, the more lost we became. Night fell quickly, and with it came a cold that cut straight to the bone. Linda and I huddled together, trying to stay warm, but there was no comfort to be found in that place. The shadows grew longer, stretching out like fingers ready to snatch us up. That's when we saw them, figures moving in the fog, just beyond the edge of our vision. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light or my imagination running wild, but Linda saw them too. They were real, and they were watching us. We tried to stay calm, telling ourselves that if we just kept moving, we'd find a way out. But every path we took seemed to lead us back to the same place. The whispers started soon after, soft at first, barely more than a breeze rustling through the trees, but they grew louder, more insistent. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but they filled me with a sense of dread I couldn't shake. Linda squeezed my hand, her grip tight, her knuckles white with fear. "We have to keep going," she whispered, but I could hear the doubt in her voice. Each time we tried to leave, the diary seemed to change, as if it were alive and reacting to our attempts. New entries appeared, describing our frantic efforts to escape, our growing fear, and the strange figures that seemed to be closing in on us. It was like the diary was mocking us, taunting us with our own helplessness. I tried to throw it away, but it always ended up back in my hands, as if it had a mind of its own. No matter what we did, we couldn't get rid of it. The figures in the fog became more distinct, taking on shapes that were almost human, but not quite. They moved with a jerky, unnatural grace, like puppets on invisible strings. I wanted to call out to them, to ask for help, but something deep inside me knew better. These weren't people, they were something else, something darker, something that didn't belong in our world. And they were getting closer. Linda and I stumbled through the darkness, our breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I could feel her fear, and I knew she could feel mine. We were running out of options, out of time. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and the figures in the fog multiplied, surrounding us on all sides. I felt a hand brush against my shoulder, and I spun around, ready to fight, but there was nothing there. Just more fog, more shadows, more whispers. I could feel myself starting to break, my mind unraveling under the weight of it all. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the fog parted, revealing a new path, one we hadn't seen before. It led deeper into the town, into the heart of the darkness that surrounded us. Linda looked at me, her eyes wide with fear, but I could see a flicker of hope there too. Maybe this was our chance, our way out. I took her hand, and together, we stepped onto the new path, praying it would lead us somewhere safe. But in my gut, I knew better. We were far from safe, and the worst was yet to come. Linda and I decided we'd had enough. The diary was clearly at the center of this nightmare, and we thought that destroying it might break whatever hold it had on us. We found some old matches in one of the houses and gathered what dry wood we could find. The fog seemed to watch us as we worked, its tendrils curling and creeping closer, like it knew what we were planning. I could feel a cold sweat on my back, but I tried to ignore it. We had to do this. There was no other way. We set the diary on a pile of wood and struck a match. The small flame flickered in the cold, damp air, but it caught, and soon the wood was burning. I watched as the flames licked at the edges of the diary, the old leather cover beginning to blacken and curl. For a moment, I felt a surge of hope. Maybe this would work. Maybe we could finally end this. But then, just as quickly as it began, the fire died out. The diary lay there untouched by the flames, not even a scorch mark on it. Linda looked at me, her face pale, eyes wide with disbelief. "This isn't possible," she whispered. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we had to keep trying. I grabbed the diary and threw it back on the fire, but it was like the flames wouldn't touch it. No matter how much wood we added, no matter how many matches we struck, the fire wouldn't burn it. It was like the diary was protected by some unseen force, something that didn't want it destroyed. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I turned to see a dark figure standing in the doorway of the house we just left. It was tall and thin, its face hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on us, cold and unblinking. I grabbed Linda's arm, my voice barely a whisper. "We have to go. Now." But she was frozen, staring at the figure, her mouth open in a silent scream. I pulled her away, and we stumbled back, tripping over our own feet in our haste to get away. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching, as if waiting for something. I felt a chill run down my spine, colder than anything I'd ever felt before. It was like the air around us had turned to ice, freezing us in place. Linda finally snapped out of it and grabbed my hand, and together we ran, not knowing where we were going, just needing to get away from that thing. But the further we ran, the stronger the feeling grew that we weren't alone. We stopped to catch our breath, our backs pressed against the wall of an old building. I could hear Linda's heart pounding in her chest, her breaths coming in short, sharp gasps. I wanted to say something, to comfort her, but I didn't know what to say. What do you say when you're trapped in a nightmare with no way out? When the very thing you thought would save you turns out to be useless? All I could do was hold her close and hope that somehow we'd find a way out of this. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was no way out. Not while that thing was here, watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake. I could feel its presence, growing stronger with every passing moment, like it was feeding off our fear. I didn't know what it wanted, but I knew it wasn't going to let us go without a fight. And in that moment, I realized that the diary wasn't just a book, it was a key, a link to something far darker and more dangerous than we could ever have imagined. And destroying it wasn't going to be as simple as lighting a match. We finally managed to find a way out of the ghost town at dawn, feeling a strange mix of relief and dread. The first rays of sunlight cut through the fog, revealing a narrow path leading out of the town. Linda and I didn't waste a second. We ran toward it, our footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. As we reached the edge of the town, I glanced back one last time, and that's when I saw it. The specter stood there at the town's entrance, staring at us with hollow eyes. I could feel its gaze burning into my back, a reminder that we weren't free yet. As we drove away, I felt a brief moment of relief wash over me, but it was quickly replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. I could still see the ghost town in the rearview mirror, and as the fog began to close in around it again, the specter didn't move. It just stood there, watching us leave. I tried to shake the feeling that we were being followed, that no matter how far we drove, we'd never really escape. Linda seemed to sense it too, her grip on the steering wheel tight, her eyes darting nervously between the road and the mirror. We thought we were safe once we were back on the main road, but then I saw it, a dark shape in the rearview mirror, hovering just behind our car. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but then it started to get closer. I could see its outline more clearly, a shadowy figure that seemed to glide across the ground, moving faster than any human could. I glanced at Linda, but she was focused on the road ahead, her knuckles white with tension. I didn't want to scare her, but I knew I had to say something. "Linda, don't look back," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just keep driving." She nodded, her eyes fixed on the road, but I could see the fear in her eyes. I didn't dare look back again, but I could feel it. Whatever was following us was getting closer. The temperature in the car dropped suddenly, and I could see my breath fogging up the windshield. The diary had mysteriously reappeared on the dashboard, untouched by the flames, its pages blank but waiting. I reached out to touch it, and as soon as my fingers brushed the cover, a jolt of electricity shot through me. The specter was still with us, its presence unmistakable. I could feel its icy grip on my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. I tried to focus on the road, on Linda, on anything but the creeping darkness behind us. But it was hard to ignore the feeling that we were being hunted, that the specter wouldn't rest until it had what it wanted. I didn't know what that was, but I had a sinking feeling that it involved us. The diary seemed to pulse with a life of its own, its blank pages whispering secrets I couldn't quite hear. As we sped down the road, I tried to think of a plan, some way to shake off the specter's grip. But every idea I had seemed futile. The diary was still there, mocking us with its presence, a constant reminder that we couldn't escape. Linda's hands were shaking, and I could tell she was on the verge of panic. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay, but I couldn't bring myself to lie. Not when I could feel the darkness closing in around us, like a noose tightening with every mile. And then, as if on cue, the road ahead of us began to blur. The fog that had plagued us in the ghost town was back, thicker than ever, swallowing up the road and everything around it. I could barely see a few feet in front of the car, and I knew we had to stop, but something told me that stopping was exactly what the specter wanted. So we kept driving, deeper into the fog, deeper into the unknown, with no idea where we were going or what we would find. All we knew was that we couldn't stop, not now, not ever. Back home, things didn't return to normal. The diary continued to write itself, as if some unseen hand was still at work, crafting our story without our consent. Every morning, we'd wake up to new entries describing what we'd done the day before, sometimes even predicting things we hadn't done yet. It was like living in a nightmare where our every move was dictated by some dark, unseen force. Linda and I were on edge constantly, afraid to do anything that might make the specter angry, afraid of what might happen if we didn't follow the diary's script. At first, we tried to ignore it, hoping that if we didn't give it any power, it would just go away. But that was easier said than done. The specter began appearing in our home, creeping closer each night. At first, it was just a shadow in the corner of the room, a fleeting glimpse in the mirror, but it soon became more tangible, more real. I'd see it out of the corner of my eye, standing in the hallway, watching us. Linda saw it too, and it terrified her. She refused to leave the house, convinced that stepping outside would seal our fate. We tried everything to rid ourselves of it. We burned the diary again, buried it, even tried to drown it in the lake, but it always came back, perfectly intact, waiting for us on the kitchen table the next morning. It was like it was mocking us, reminding us that we couldn't escape. The entries grew more sinister, describing things that hadn't happened yet, things we didn't want to happen. I could feel the specter's presence growing stronger, its grip tightening around us with every passing day. I reached out to a friend who was a paranormal investigator, hoping he might have some answers. He came over one evening, his face grim as he walked through our house, sensing the energy that lingered in the air. "Whatever this is," he said, "it's not just a ghost. It's something much darker, something that feeds on fear and despair." He suggested a cleansing ritual, something to break the specter's hold on us. But as we prepared for the ritual, the diary's pages began to turn on their own, as if the specter knew what we were planning and was warning us to stop. The ritual seemed to have the opposite effect, angering the specter rather than banishing it. That night, the whispers returned, louder than ever, filling our heads with a cacophony of voices, each one more terrifying than the last. Linda and I huddled together in our bed, covering our ears, but the voices wouldn't stop. I could feel the specter's presence growing closer, its cold breath on the back of my neck. I knew we couldn't stay here much longer, but I didn't know where else to go. It seemed like no matter where we went, the specter would follow. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw its face, hollow and empty, like a void that could never be filled. It was like the specter was always there, just beyond the edge of my vision, waiting for the right moment to strike. I tried to stay strong for Linda, but I could feel myself slipping, my sanity unraveling with each passing day. The diary was always there, always watching, always waiting. I could feel its pull, like a magnet drawing me closer to the darkness it held within its pages. Linda started talking about leaving, about running away, but I knew it wouldn't work. The specter would find us, no matter where we went. I could see it in her eyes, the fear, the desperation, the sense that we were trapped in a nightmare we couldn't wake up from. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her that everything would be okay, but I couldn't. Not when I knew that the diary was still writing, still recording, still predicting every move we made. The specter was still here, and it wasn't going anywhere.